Well, this is our last class. I've enjoyed having you guys. MC 101 is one of my favorite classes to teach. And so I hope you've enjoyed it and that you've gotten a lot out of it. Um, a few announcements to kind of make before we talk about this last chapter. Um, One is if you haven't done the course evaluation, I'm not trying to harp on you, but because we're not meeting face to face, I can't pass them out. They're online. I'd appreciate it if you would take a couple minutes and do the course evaluation. You should have gotten some emails about that. Um, your exam. One of the things I did this morning is I went in and gave you a little extra time to take the test. I think the first three exams you had 60 minutes or an hour, and I decided just to give you all 90 minutes just to relieve some of the stress of it. So you've got a little more time to take the test this time. The test opens on Sunday at midnight and it runs through Tuesday. And I did that in part because Sunday night you have to get your media report assignment in. Obviously, you can do that early, but since that was due Sunday, I wanted to give you Monday and Tuesday to take the test. And so it opens, if you get the media assignment done early, the test is open the 6th, 7th, and 8th until 11:55. And again, you have an hour and a half to take the test once you open it. You can't start and stop. But the test is over the last material since the previous test, and I believe that includes public relations, journalism, media effects, and media law. But it says it on the Moodle page. But since the last test, everything forward. There are study guides for you to help you study. And law is the last section, so we're going to talk about these PowerPoints today. And don't forget to do your forums. Some of you have them done and I've graded them and posted your grade, but some of you, I don't know if the people on this call, but some people in the class haven't done 16, 17, 18, 19, or 20. That's a loss of a lot of points. So please, please do those by Friday. They're pretty simple. I would get them done as soon as possible. So don't forget to post your last forums. Don't forget to post your last 25-point assignment. And then the test will be Monday and Tuesday. Again, you can even take it Sunday if you want to, but some of you may not be ready. So I wanted to give you a 3-day window by which you could take the test. Are there any questions about what's due, what's expected? Any questions from anybody? I'm assuming you're out there. I see your names. Okay.
I don't have any questions.
Okay, thanks for responding. It's okay. I mean, if I was taking the class, I would not have my picture up either. I would just have my name up, and I appreciate you're here. But it's nice to get a response from somebody to make sure everything's happening here. So I'm double checking the names. Okay, well, without further ado, let's talk about the mass media law chapter. If as you go to do your forms, your media report, or study for the test, you can always email me, and I pretty much email the same day I receive them. So we won't be communicating via Zoom anymore, but if you need anything, email me and I'll get back to you. Okay. Also, anyone who's earned extra credit in the class, all that extra credit has already been applied to one of your exams. So there's no extra credit out there pending. Okay, media law. And I'm going to just see it so you just see one person because I don't want to block the slides. Well, we've talked quite a bit in this class this semester about the First Amendment. And just a second here. And the First Amendment is part of the Bill of Rights. And it gives us our 5 freedoms of speech, religion, press, and assembly. I'm sorry, just a second here. There we go. And so the mass media have always enjoyed a lot of protection from the First Amendment and from the government, but the First Amendment has never meant to be absolute. You don't have an absolute right to speech. You have a pretty strong right to speech. I can't take a vote and decide, I don't want to hear from Paige because I just don't like what Paige says. So we're going to take a vote and deny her free speech. No, Paige has a constitutional right to free speech, but the government can sometimes infringe upon it if someone, well, let's not pick on Paige. Let's say if I was out speaking in a manner that incited a riot, the government would have a compelling interest to stop me because I'm inciting a riot. So your free speech stops where it harms others. And that's also hard to determine what that means sometimes. And so the First Amendment protects speech, religion, press, assembly, and the right to petition your government. So the mass media law that we're going to study is the area of law that concerns the media and protections. And you'll see the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, will balance a person's right to speech versus the betterment of the community or the society. And so there's always a balancing act between rights, your rights and my rights, and how they're applied. This is just a slide telling you what's in the book. I'm not going to read this to you, but it is going to, one of the things that you should understand by the end of this class is the philosophy behind the First Amendment. What are some of the legal limits to the First Amendment and to other things? Why we have a Federal Communications Commission. It is a government organization that regulates broadcasting. FTC also is a regulatory body. And we're going to talk a little bit about, the laws governing pornography and obscenity, because obscenity is not a protected form of speech, but we do have things that are protected speech that are a sexual nature. And so the court draws a line between what's protected and what's not. I'm also going to talk briefly about copyright and consumer rights and that kind of thing. And New York Times versus Sullivan is a really important case. So these are just some of the main things the chapter talks about. The chapter likes to start with anecdotes related to the content. And this particular chapter begins with an anecdote about how flash mobs began. And that flash mobs began to become popular, particularly with the rise of cell phones and the ability to text and contact people. And flash mobs have popped up in a lot of different places. There was some attempt to kind of squelch those, thinking that, maybe getting mobs of people together is not a good idea. Although the point of a flash mob is not to be a mob so much as to have fun. But the book opens up talking about freedoms by talking about the trend of flash mobs. There's actually an entire course at our university on media law. So we're just going to give you a little snapshot here. But when people came to the New World or came to America to form a new country, one of the things they were doing is they were seeking religious freedom from the British Crown, that basically the church was the head of the state in England, and you really weren't allowed to have religious freedom. Also, a lot of the monarchs, it seems like once you get a crown, they spend the rest of their life trying to keep the crown. And so going back to Henry VIII and some of the other monarchs, they used to try to squelch the press by licensing them or calling them fake news. So if you thought fake news was a new thing related to Donald Trump or other politicians, it's not. It goes all the way back to England and monarchies who were trying to keep the press from criticizing them. And so when America was colonized, it was under the crown until we broke away in the American Revolution. The American Revolution happened in part because we wanted to have freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom to petition, and freedom to meet. And so these freedoms, these civil liberties, if you will, are very, very, very important. And they're encapsulated in the First Amendment, which there are 10 amendments to the Constitution. They're known as the Bill of Rights. And the First Amendment has these civil liberties in them. So free expression is a foundational concept of our country. Now, Daniel Ellsberg is an interesting character. He was a person who was very pro Vietnam War. When America went to the Vietnam War, a lot of people felt that if we didn't, if we did not go there, that Vietnam would become a communist country and there'd be a domino effect where communism would take over. President Eisenhower was the first president to espouse the domino theory. And what it was America and Russia were competing for the worldview, democracy versus communism. And so one of the reasons we got involved in Vietnam was to try to help curb communism from growing. Well, we were in the war, I think, longer than people anticipated. And at some point, the American presidents, because there were several of them that were in charge when we were in the war, because Vietnam starts kind of with Eisenhower and then Kennedy, and then Johnson really escalates it. And then Nixon is elected by promising to end the war. So Americans become disenchanted with the war. They want it to end. And one of the things that happened during the Nixon administration is that they decided to have people within the Defense Department. Ellsberg worked for a contractor and knew a lot about defense. He had gone to Vietnam as an observer, and they decided to write a history of the war and the history of the decision-making process. Daniel Ellsberg was one of several writers that helped write this report. It became known as the Pentagon Papers. It was not a strategy paper on how to win the war. It was a historical look at the decisions leading up to where we had been. Ellsberg was sent to Vietnam to, I know this is a long-winded story, but Ellsberg's a very pivotal figure. Ellsberg was sent to Vietnam to kind of observe and find out what's going on. He came back convinced we couldn't win the war. Now, militarily, America is a much stronger country than Vietnam. So yes, we could have probably taken some nuclear bombs and annihilated them, but that's not exactly the kind of way we wanted to win. And it was a different kind of war for us because it was kind of fought in the jungles and there weren't clear battle lines like there were in World War I and World War II. So Ellsberg came back and thought, we can't win. And then he got a copy of this report called the Pentagon Papers. And he read in that the American presidents had been lying to the American people, that Johnson and presidents before him realized we couldn't win the war, but they didn't want to lose the first American war in history. And so they kept us in and they kept sending more and more troops. And there was a lot of stuff in the Pentagon Papers. So Ellsberg decided that he wanted to try to end the war, and that if the American people knew they'd been lied to, then it might turn public opinion. So Ellsberg leaks the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times that begins running them. Nixon's White House, for the first time in American history, got an injunction and stopped a newspaper from publishing. It's the first and only time in American history that the national government stopped a newspaper from publishing. So then Ellsberg leaked them to the Washington Post. The Washington Post was also enjoined. So the New York Times and the Washington Post take their Supreme Court case, or their case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sides with them and said, this is not a classified document. This is a historical document. There's no reason why the papers can't print the stories. And Nixon lost the court case. Well, sure enough, the Pentagon Papers did turn public opinion, and we did end our involvement in the war during Nixon's administration. But Ellsberg was a controversial figure at the time because the documents that he leaked were classified. And so it technically was treason, but some people said his greatest act of treason was his greatest act of patriotism, because he told the American people that their government was lying to them and helped end the war. So in the Ellsberg case, you can kind of see the tension between the people, the newspapers, and the government sometimes, and how they have to keep a check on themselves. The First Amendment in context, I think I've already kind of talked to you about that. The whole notion was, even if it's uncomfortable sometimes, everybody has a right to free speech. That one of the things that's interesting about the First Amendment is it's not a majoritarian document. It's counter-majoritarian. What's that mean? Well, we're democracy. And so when we want a new mayor, we want a new president, we want a new city council, we vote, and the most votes wins. So the new mayor and the new president, the new city council, if they get the most votes, they're in office. We vote democratically. But there are a few things so crucial to being an American: speech, press, religion, that we don't vote on them. Like I said before, we cannot decide, raise our hands and decide that one of us doesn't have the right to speech because the Constitution protects it. So that's kind of a libertarian view of those civil liberties. Any questions? Okay. The fourth branch of government is an interesting concept. You know, we have three branches in our government. We have the executive branch, which is the president and the cabinet. We have the court system, and we have Congress, the legislative system. But the press operates as sort of a fourth branch of government. It's unofficial, but the press acts as a watchdog on government, and so it's often called the fourth branch. Common sense in the First Amendment. The First Amendment gives us extremely high protections, but they're not absolute. And some of the limits on speech kind of are common sense. You're not supposed to be able to yell fire in a movie theater because, you know, people might trample each other, that kind of thing. The incitement standard is kind of an interesting one. And what that means is we allow for uncomfortable speech, because it would be really hard to decide your speech is comfortable, but mine is uncomfortable, and why. So part of the whole milieu is that everyone gets to say their ideas, and then the marketplace of ideas, the good one will rise and the bad ones will fall. But so we allow things like the KKK to have parades and stuff like that, even though that might be a front, because they basically stand for racism. And so that's offensive to us. But they're allowed their speech too, because it's kind of a messy way to do things. But once we tell them they can't speak, then who's next? Is it the Kiwanis Club? That's kind of an exaggeration, but who's next? Now, however, the incitement standard is different. And that is if the KKK were to have a rally or a parade, and then they would incite the crowd to do lynchings or incite the crowd to hurt people, the government will step in and stop that. And so the incitement standard is that the government has a compelling interest to stop people from hurting one another. And so anyway, that's what that means. First Amendment protects spoken rights, but it also protects written things like literature. And there have been different controversies over literature and book banning and things like that. Ulysses and Lady Chatterley's Lover are literature that were controversial, and some people sought to ban. The First Amendment doesn't really ban books, but it also does not protect obscenity. So we're going to get to that a little bit later. There's a slide on obscenity. Amusement in the First Amendment, First Amendment protects entertainment media, video games, things like that. That's all protected. Emotive speech, hate speech, expressive speech, they're all protected until and unless they incite something or they might hurt somebody else, or the government has a compelling state interest to stop it. So and that's why we have a court system, because sometimes it's not easy to know where that line's drawn. The Federal Communications Commission was established when the electronic medium developed. So it's one thing to have newspapers, magazines, and other forms of print media, but when Marconi developed wireless technology and other people came along and radio was invented, there were several concerns with electronic media that aren't concerns with broadcast media that then sometimes raise First Amendment questions. For example, there are a limited number of frequencies. So somebody needs to monitor, if you will, what radio station can have a license, what TV station can have a license, because the frequencies are not unlimited. Also, the power of the electronic media is just different. You hear something over the airwaves or watch it with your eyes, and it's just different than print. And so the FCC was created in part to monitor or regulate electronic mediums. The FTC was founded to help address commercial speech and political speech. And that's a really, all of these areas are broad areas. So we're just kind of hitting highlights. But commercial speech, one of the things that happened early on before the FTC existed is that some advertisers, not all, but some advertisers made false claims, and consumers would buy things and they wouldn't be what they said. We talked before about patent medicines. They would claim that if you bought this particular patent medicine, it would cure different things, which, one of them was, it'd make you feel better. And it was, 60% alcohol or something. So the FTC monitors the advertising industry and commercial speech and protects consumers. Also, there was a concern with political speech that you're supposed to give sort of equal time to different candidates and hold candidates accountable for making outlandish comments about their opponents. They still do that, but it's more regulated than it used to be. Okay, how are we doing? We're doing good. Indecency is a really big area of the law because it dates back to the 1800s where people were worried about certain things that were in print. And so one of the things that the US Supreme Court said is that pornography is protected and obscenity is not. So what's the difference? Well, in part, pornography is something that has some redeeming value according to the courts, and that obscenity is something that is just sexually obsessively sexual without redeeming value. The definitions are more expansive than that, but basically the Supreme Court decides what is and is not obscenity, and if it's ruled as obscenity, it's not protected. There's a very famous quote from Justice Potter Stewart in a Supreme Court case. He said that I can't define obscenity, but I know it when I see it. And so the court has spent a lot of time trying to define these terms in order to resolve cases. I think I'm going to stop for just a minute and tell you a little bit about the Supreme Court. I don't know if you know this, but when I was a reporter back in the 90s, I covered the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court does is it receives a lot of writs, and they call writ of certiorari every year, asking the court to take their case. They take a very small percentage of the cases, and when they do, they're trying to define something or set a precedent for the future. And so the Supreme Court has weighed in with several decisions trying to define pornography and obscenity so they know what's protected and not. I'll give you an example. It's kind of simplistic. I've never looked at this publication myself, but apparently Playboy magazine used to have a reputation that, yes, it had a lot of graphic photographs, but it had really good articles. And that sounds kind of silly. People always snicker at that. But like in the 1970s, Playboy magazine interviewed President Carter. I think he was running for office then. He may not have been president. I don't remember the exact year. And in the interview, President Carter is a Southern Baptist, and he was trying to talk to them about a verse in scripture where it is said that not only should a man not be unfaithful to his wife, but he shouldn't even think about other women. And so if you think about other women, that's a sin too. And so Jimmy Carter said not only he always been faithful to his wife, Rosalind, but that he had sometimes lusted after women in his heart. That freaked everybody out because they didn't know what he meant. He was trying to talk about a scripture verse where he was just saying, you know, it's impossible to not think to yourself, that's a beautiful woman or whatever. He never had affairs, that kind of thing. But that was an article that has followed Carter his whole life. And so they did profiles like that in Playboy. So what the Supreme Court would say is there's a redeeming social value in the articles. And so that would not be considered obscene. That would be considered, you know, a dirty magazine with some value. One of the things the court has tried to do is to protect children, because they try to protect children from seeing pornography, but also from being the subject of pornography. As obscene as it might seem to us, there are people that do child pornography and put children in pornography. Child pornography is illegal. And so children are not supposed to be exposed to it, in it, any sort of thing. So one of the things that the legal system has done is try to protect children from being kind of abused by being in pornography or having access to it. So there's a lot of laws about that. And again, it's a really, we could talk a whole week on these sets of laws, but it just kind of gives you a general idea. Another big area of the law is one dealing with intellectual property. Now, I'm sure there's somebody in this class that wants to write a book or has written different things. Maybe you want to be a filmmaker. intellectual property laws protects your creativity if you've created something. So there's something called copyright. So if I publish a book, that book can be copyrighted so nobody else can just take it. And copyright laws are pretty complex and complicated, but at the base of it is, if you are the creator of a work, whether it be film or something in print or any kind of work you may have created, you're the owner of it. You have it. People can use your copyrighted work with your permission. So sometimes what they do is they will ask permission of the copyright holder, and sometimes it's granted, and sometimes it's granted with a fee. And depending on what it is, it can be a pretty hefty fee. And so if you're going to go into the publishing industry, you want to make sure that anything that you publish, that it's clear of any copyright problems. If you're going to be a freelancer and do assignments, I did a lot of freelancing, they will usually ask you to sign a contract. And in that contract, they'll say, we're hiring you to do this article, we're going to pay you this, but as a result, you're signing the copyright over. So even though you're the author of it, if you're being hired by a publication to do the story, they often will hold the copyright. And so you just have to get all that straight and make sure who knows who owns what. There's also, it's not on this slide, but there's also something called fair use. And you guys do this all the time. When you write a paper for me, or you write a paper for any other class, you'll read a book or you read an article, and sometimes you'll pull a quote from that and you'll put it in your paper. And that material is copyrighted. So, you don't have to get permission if you just pull like one quote here, one quote there. So there's a part of the law that says you can use something copyrighted in terms of fair use, but it needs to be a very, very small amount. You guys still with me out there?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I just feel like I'm talking really fast, but
No, you're
okay.
fine. I do
Thank
have a
you.
question. Since we're on like the term of copyright, I
Yeah.
saw someone, they wrote like a play for a class, and like the teacher, like they took it and they just like changed like the names in it and they produce it as their own play. So that would be considered like copywriting, correct?
Well, I'd have to know more, and I'm not a lawyer myself, but it sounds like, and I don't know the whole thing, but I'm going to tell you just from what you described, it sounds like the person who's the originator of the play could probably bring a suit. So in order for you to prove a copyright infringement, you have to take them to court. And it also depends if that student had an arrangement with the teacher. They might have signed some paperwork. But if a teacher just takes your work that you've presented in class and presents it as their own, that's probably an infringement. Although I don't want to point fingers at another teacher if I don't know the whole situation. But yes, if you've written something, somebody takes it, just changes a name, that's probably not a good thing. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I'll give you an example. I think you guys know I write history books. I wrote a book on Eisenhower that was published in 2014. And as a part of my contract with my publisher, they wanted to own the rights to it. And so some authors will demand to keep the rights themselves. It was my first academic book. I just wanted a deal, so I signed away my rights. No big deal because they published it and my name's on it. But let's say I'd written some kind of popular book and they wanted to make a movie out of it. My publisher would get all the proceeds and I'd get nothing. And so, you do need to be careful before you sign away your rights. although I was pretty sure they weren't going to make a movie out of my book. And so I thought I was on pretty solid ground. So yeah, it's a whole interesting thing, but in terms of who owns what. Consumer rights. Consumers have rights when in terms of advertising, but one area that consumers have done that's wrong is kind of they've used technology to download music without paying. That's what the Grokster case was about, or Grokster was about, is downloading things without paying. And the music industry has, tried to keep up, but the moment they think they fixed a problem, there's some new technology that gets around it. So in that case, people aren't getting paid for their creations, and that's wrong. Okay, defamation. Well, your right to free speech is pretty strong, but again, it ends, a good rule of thumb is it kind of ends where you hurt other people. And so if you're a reporter, or I guess really a private citizen can do this too, and you publish something in writing that hurts somebody and they sue you, you might be sued for libel. Now, if it's broadcast, like it's broadcast on TV, it's slander. So libel and slander are the same thing, except libel is written defamation and slander is spoken defamation. So libel as a concept, basically reporters make mistakes. Hopefully you don't make very many, or you're not a very good reporter. But when you're writing a story, one of the things that, depending upon what kind of story you're writing, if you do an investigative piece, sometimes people don't tell you the truth because they're hiding things. And sometimes you just get misled, or sometimes you just make an honest mistake. That's not what libel is. Okay, so libel is basically something that's untrue, that defames a person and causes them harm. And so one of the things that has been difficult is trying to prove, how much harm is done and that kind of thing. And so there have been different Supreme Court cases. And there was a very important case back in 1964 called New York Times versus Sullivan. And in that case, Martin Luther King had been jailed. And some of Martin Luther King Jr.'s supporters took out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, let's free Dr. King, let's get him out of jail. And in the ad, they had a few factual errors that were not on purpose, they were accidents. But in the ad, they also said that basically they didn't name anybody by name, but they said that the police were corrupt in that town, and that's why he was in jail. So New York Times versus Sullivan gets its name because the police commissioner was named L.B. Sullivan. And he basically sued and argued that the New York Times had libeled him because you don't have to name him. If you say the police in this town are corrupt and he's the police commissioner, you're basically saying he's corrupt. And there were some factual errors in the ad. So the New York Times, or the Supreme Court, ruled in favor of the New York Times. It said in this ruling that basically there were a few factual errors, but they weren't really germane to the main point, which is whether or not the police were corrupt. They were inadvertent, accidental errors. And that they didn't have a reckless disregard for the truth. And so one of the things that New York Times versus Sullivan said was that if you're dealing with a public official, like the police commissioner, then you have to prove actual malice towards the police commissioner. So in other words, the Supreme Court gave the press a lot of protection Because when you're running a newspaper, sometimes you make mistakes and you run corrections, but that's not, if you're dealing with public officials, necessarily liable. So the court said Mr. Sullivan had to prove that the New York Times had actual malice against him. And what actual malice means is a reckless disregard for the truth. We knew it was false and we published it anyway. That's really hard to prove. If you're a public official, it is hard to prove that a newspaper knew something was wrong and published it anyway. You have to prove that in a court of law. So basically, New York Times versus Sullivan gives newspapers and reporters and broadcast stations, a whole lot of leeway to accidentally make mistakes. That doesn't mean that you can just say anything about any public official, but it does mean that the court tilts things in favor of the paper, because one of the rationales is if you're run for public office, you open yourself up for public criticism. It's different with a private citizen. If the New York Times had libeled you or me, or I shouldn't use the word libel because the court said they didn't, but if the New York Times published something harsh about us, there's a lower standard because we haven't run for office. So in order to libel somebody, what you've printed has to be false. They have to be able to be identified, and it has to cause them harm. I'll give you an example. Back in the 1980s, Carol Burnett, who I hope you guys know who she is. She's an older actress who I believe she's still alive, but I don't think she does anything anymore. But in the 80s, she had her own show. It was called The Carol Burnett Show. And the National Enquirer, which has been around for a long time, publishes untruths about people all the time. People just kind of accept it as, a silly newspaper. They might read it, but they don't necessarily believe everything's true. Well, Carol Burnett was at a restaurant with her daughter, and the National Enquirer ran an article saying that Carol Burnett was in a public restaurant. She was rude and drunk. Well, she wasn't drunk and she wasn't rude. And that doesn't sound like much, right? I mean, compared to the things they say about President Trump or Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, just fill in the insult to those kind of people. Saying somebody was rude and drunk, at a public restaurant, it's not like they said she drove drunk. But Carol Burnett took great umbrance at that because she was not rude. She was known for being kind, and she wasn't drunk. Matter of fact, I don't think she was even drinking. They just kind of made it up. So Carol Burnett sued. She said they libeled me. And it's kind of uncharacteristic for somebody to sue the National Enquirer, but Carol Burnett said it was the principle. They just made it up. She won, which was something. She won because she proved that the newspaper knew it was wrong and just made it up. But she didn't get very much in terms of damages. I can't remember the amount now, but it was considered relatively small because the court said that the newspaper had a reckless disregard for the truth when it came to Miss Burnett, but she wasn't really harmed by it because it's not like she lost her job or she lost her reputation. Nobody believed it in the first place. So she won kind of a moral victory. But the damages, had Carol Burnett lost a job as a result of that, she would have gotten a lot more money. Or had her reputation actually been damaged, she would have gotten a lot more money. So that's kind of how it works. So obviously, like I said, we have a whole class in our department called Media Law, and Dr. Buck and I both teach that class. And so, what we just talked about today, you could talk about over 16 weeks, but this is just kind of a quick overview. So we talked a little bit about censorship, how the First Amendment has been expanded, government's part in regulating it, the whole notion of indecency. Some things that are indecent, if there's a moral, if there's a value to them, then they're protected. If it's seen as having no value, they're not. Intellectual property is really important, and so is defamation. So those are the main things. When you get ready for the test, make sure you print out the study guides for each section and make sure you know the concepts. I was talking to one of you guys after class. I don't remember who it was now. And it was after the last test. And I was just saying to the student, I said, some students don't, the study guide doesn't seem to be helping them. And really the study guide are the test questions. I don't give you the exact answers. And after talking, I realized maybe part of it is if you're just going looking for the answer and writing it down, you need to read everything within context and get an understanding of it and then write down your study guide. So make sure those study guides will really help you ace the test. And I hope you guys do. I want everyone to end with the best possible grade. But that's our lesson for today. And does anybody have any questions about what's due or anything before we sign off?
I don't.
You don't? Okay. I will assume you're speaking for the group. Any questions? Okay. Again, thank you. You were a great class, and I look forward to reading your forums and your media reports and then giving you a grade probably by the end of next week, middle of the week or end of next week. Email me with any questions, and I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and everybody. It's been a good class. Let me stop the recording.